Welcome to the third module. We are going to focus on framing inequality sociologically. The required reading is Flores, Chapter 3. There's also an open book test, which is an required activity for this week. Ensure that you complete the test before Sunday at 2 p.m. The learning objectives for this module include to show how philosophical insights into the human condition serve as prototypes for a sociological study of social inequality, to point out how debates over social inequality are informed by three blaming paradigms. The next is to appreciate how functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and radical conflict theories of society encapsulate different approaches to social inequality. The next is to illustrate the concept of social inequality as structural exclusion. Following is to demonstrate the concept of microaggression as racism through pronoun. So let's begin with the introduction. What's the cause? Where's the source? Who is to blame? So think about these three following quotes. First by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Man is born free, and he is everywhere in chains. The next is Thomas Hobbes. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. John Locke. No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience. So if you reflect back on those quotes, Rousseau noted that society has betrayed man's natural liberty, equality, fraternity. There's forces of domination and exploitation that has subverted his innate goodness by transforming him into an oppressed being. Reflecting back on Hobbes, man's natural inclination to maximize self-interest, there's an unfettered individualism, had been curtailed for the safety and survival of the collective whole. Okay, now reflecting on Locke. Humans were neither innately good or inherently evil. They just were. People born as blank slates. Their thoughts and actions reflected the realities, experiences, and the engagement with the world. Okay, so now we're going to look at explanatory frameworks and sociological models. So there is blame the victim, blame the system, blame the situation. In terms of sociological models of society, blame the individual or the victim is a more functionalist approach. There's a function of society for everything, if you recall from previous sociological courses. Blame the system is more of a radical conflict, and blame the situation is symbolic interactionism. In terms of the approaches consistent with sociological models, to blame the victim is biological, psychological, and anthropological, while blame the system is Marxist, feminist, and structural approach. The philosophical underpinnings of the human conditions are, for instance, blame the victim, Hobbes, blame the system, Rousseau, blame the situation, Locke. So those three initial quotes that we explored earlier. So for instance, Hobbes, his quote was, "In the life of man, solidarity, poor, nasty, brutish, and short," fits in with blaming the individual. Rousseau notes, "Man born free, and he is everywhere in chains." There's more of this radical conflict that's going on, which is blame the system. Then Locke notes, "No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience." And that relations to blaming the situation that the man lives in. Okay, so now we're going to go into a bit more detail about the different blaming systems. So the first is blame the individual. This model identifies individual failure as a prime cause of social inequality. So for instance, the poor are to blame for their own poverty. Psychological dispositions, for instance, cultural deprivation, faulty socialization, moral shortcomings, circumstance in their own making. So it's the individual that is inherently at fault for the poverty, for their experienced social inequality. In terms of functionalist, inequality is integral to a complex and productive society. So, for instance, all societies must devise a method for motivating their best individuals to occupy the most important and difficult situations. So, functionalists interpret inequalities as normal and necessary. So, in terms of functionalist-friendly approaches, biology, certain individuals are better adapted for success in competitive struggle for society. Psychological, the origins of inequality taps into human psyche. Inequality is an instinctual adaptation to challenges of survival. Cultural anthropology approach. Cultural lifestyles of the poor at odds with competitive consumerist lifestyles. Poverty elicits a cultural response to marginal conditions. So all these different approaches are connected to functionalism, which is connected in this overall umbrella idea of blame the individual, blame the victim model. This model holds society accountable for social inequality. Problems of social inequality are situated within the institutional structures and the ideological arrangements. Institutions criticize for discriminatory barriers and systemic biases. Systems is slanted in favor of the rich and the powerful groups. There are three versions of radical conflict. Marxism, the class conflict divide. Feminism, the gendered concerns in relation to power and patriarchy, and the structuralists, who believe that human nature needs to be understood in relation to the overall structure in the system we live in. So now going into more depth in the different approaches. So radical conflict, Marxism. Inequality is embedded within the capitalist framework of private property. The market economy has contributed to inequality through barriers such as segmented labor. So individuals are segmented to the primary and secondary labor market, where the primary has the good, stable jobs, and secondary labor market are more precarious, vulnerable positions. The racial divisions, dual labor markets is also a very similar notion to segmented labor markets, where there's two labor markets that exist, and some individuals are able to access the primary, some are able to access the secondary. Systemic structures of discrimination. Feminism. Society is perceived as a patriarchal site of domination. Institutions, agendas, and values are designed to reflect, reinforce, and advance male interests and priorities, which then in turn creates this form of social inequality for the female gender in society, and those who do not fit into a gendered label. Radical conflict structuralism. Inequalities of power, wealth, and status are anchored in institutional structures of society. Structural inequality is rooted in the very foundation of society. How society is structured, the foundations, the roots, the core of society, leads to the structural form of inequality. Okay, so now turning to the blame the situation model. Neither the individual nor the system are entirely to blame. It acknowledges the interplay of agency with structure, context, and power. It's grounded in the principles of symbolic interactionism, where each object has a symbolic role and there's interaction between them. So according to symbolic interactionism, social reality and the intergroup dynamics are central. Inequalities of exclusion are brought into existence through meaningful interaction and interpretive practices to make sense of the world. Okay, so now to explore situating racism as a lived microaggression within our discussion of framing inequality sociologically. So racism 1.0, described as overt, blunt, direct, and deliberate, emerged from the earliest definitions of racism. Racism 2.0 is conveyed systematically at institutional levels or subliminally through subtle of interactions. Racism 3.0 and the concept of microaggressions focuses on the commonplace interactions, both verbal and nonverbal, intentional or not, that racialized minorities experience as put-downs without overt prejudices. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the table that is listed in your textbook that explains social inequality in relation to the models in society. So I'm going to go through each different model as well as answering the questions on the left column. So the functionalist model, nature societies, integrated whole of interrelated parts. The normal state of society, stability, order, consensus, cooperation. Key question: how is order achieved? What holds society together? A shared conscience. Assessment of society, society is good. Assessment of inequality, functional, necessary, inevitable, beneficial. What is the cause? Who's to blame? Blame the individual victim. Proposed solution to inequality is change the person. Okay, so moving on now to radical conflict theory, the Marxist model. Nature society is the site of class inequality. The normal state of society is competition, conflict control, and change. Key question is, how does inequality persist? What holds society together? Hegemony, threat of force, and power. Assessment of society. Society is exploitative. Assessment of inequality, exploitative. What is the cause? Who is to blame? Blame the capitalistic system. Proposed solution, change the system. Moving on to the radical conflict theory feminist model. The site of domination for the nature of society. The normal state of society is domination, control, conflict, change. Key question is how domination is maintained. What holds society together? Hegemony, the threat of force, and power. Assessment of society. Society is dominating. Assessment of inequality, controlling. What is the cause? Who is to blame? Blame the patriarchal system. Proposed solution to inequality is to change the system. Moving on to the last model, would be symbolic interactionist model. Nature of society is the ongoing human accomplishment. The normal state of society is the dynamic interactional process. Key question: how is reality socially constructed? What holds society together? Negotiation, compromise, and self-interest. Assessment of society. Society is just a blank state. Assessment of inequality depends on context. So for instance, how the situation is defined. What is the cause? Who is to blame? Blame the situation. And the proposed solution of inequality, redefine the situation. So these models help to lead us to the different blame systems and how to overcome them based on these sociological models. So this is a very important chart that goes over the sociological models and how social inequality is connected and framed within these different sociological models. So in terms of a summary, philosophical insights of Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke for the studying and the nature of characteristics and social inequality. Debate over social inequality framed around three framing models: blame the individual, blame the system, blame the situation. The blaming models are aligned with three major sociological traditions: functionalism, radical theory, and symbolic interactions. Functionalism, radical conflict, and symbolic interactional models of society have fundamentally different approaches to social inequality. And they link up to those blame them models. Microaggression is also seen to be racism 3.0, exemplifying a symbolic interactionist approach to social inequality.